Dawn of the Dead. Here's when you had to leave.
It was early morning in suburban Milwaukee. A few hours earlier, you just got home from a long
Milwaukee,
shift, gone to bed,
where
and
Jeffrey
expected to
Dahmer was
wake up
at.
on the same street you'd been driving down for years. Instead, you woke up in a world turned upside down, and the worst part was that this didn't happen while you were asleep. It had been building for a while, through crowded ER intakes, and news reports that were being downplayed as contained, right up until they stopped being either. The signs were right in front of you, and you still went to sleep thinking tomorrow would be just another day. And that's why so many people in this movie ran out of movement options before they knew the clock was even ticking. Now, most people talk about Dawn of the Dead like it was
But like, this is kind of scary because this is kind of what we probably going through right now. Not gonna lie, there's too much shit, COVID shit, fake, man.
just a
Trying to
story
tell
about
you.
survival in a mall. But the mall was where everything they ignored finally caught up to them. The stretch that decided who lived came earlier, in that narrow window before anyone reached those doors. When the signals were piling up and daily life still carried people right past them. The signals were everywhere. Bite victims were already pouring into hospitals, while news broadcasts cut to regular programming, and officials were still reaching for labels like race riots, chemical spills, and pent-up psychological rage, even though the infection in front of them had already outgrown every one of those explanations. And most people hearing about it thought the violence belonged to somebody else's morning, happening on streets they'd never drive down, to people they'd never meet. And that's just what we always do. It couldn't possibly happen to
I
me,
wanna know how the
right?
fuck she
That's
get
the
in her
mindset we
house.
have. But this outbreak moved
I
faster
always
than
wondered
public
that.
understanding, and people died because of that. By the time hospital staff realized these were not ordinary trauma cases, patients were already dying and coming back inside the same buildings that were trying to treat them. The news caught up a little later, and by then, the roads were already filling up with people trying to leave. That's how most people died early in this movie, because the chance to leave opened up while daily life still looked stable enough to trust, and it closed long before refuge felt secure enough to settle into. The mall entered the story offering exactly what survivors need.
That is the most dumbest shit you could do. Why the fuck would you? Yeah, just take the helicopter and go somewhere else. Like, why the fuck would you land in the middle of the fucking thing trying to chop shit down with only a limited amount of bullets? Now the helicopter leaving you down there on the ground. The fuck?
Needed during the first days of collapse, which were thick walls, stocked shelves, distant from the street, and a reason to believe they were
But Dawn of the Dead was like one of my favorite zombie movies of all time.
still safe. That belief is the hinge the whole second half of the movie turns on. So today, we'll look at what the survivors actually could have pieced together before the streets filled with zombies and the hospitals fell, and what trying to even leave looked like once the outbreak started moving faster than anyone could track. From there, we'll go into why the mall worked as a
Rule one when driving a car: always wear your seatbelt.
refuge at first, and how the same walls that kept the zombies out made leaving feel less urgent, until the survivors ran out of time to plan a real exit. Before we get into your movement windows, we need to talk about what made this outbreak different, because that changed everything about how fast you had to make a decision. Dawn of the Dead wasn't building around a slow-moving virus presence that gave institutions
All right,
time to adapt.
right there, she had mad plot armor.
Dawn of the Dead
Any other regular zombie would have bit her foot and that would have been all she wrote. But she had plot armor.
wasn't building around a slow-moving virus presence that gave institutions time to adapt. This was a fast outbreak with severe informational lag. The infection cycle from bite to death to reanimation moved faster than anyone around it could process. While the timer was running, the wider system was still trying to figure out whether it was dealing with civil unrest, an airborne plague, a chemical spill, or something else entirely. And none of the labels they were reaching for actually fit what was happening. That mismatch is where casualties piled up, because people were taking the cues from authorities who were still describing a smaller problem than the one in front of them. By the time a medical
Right now. Right now. That's us right now.
examiner
Dead
finally got in
eyes,
front of
dead
the
homies.
camera, the system was already past the point where ordinary medical language could contain what it was looking at. The doctor confirmed the bodies were technically deceased. He described an autopsy where he removed the heart and half the digestive tract, yet the body never stopped moving. He also put the reanimation window at 1 to 5 minutes from the moment the victim stopped breathing.
Every failed resuscitation, every patient who flatlined, anyone left unattended for even just a few minutes was now a potential threat. And that included individuals who were already infected but died by other means. If the infection had reached the brain, the cause of death really didn't matter, only that it actually occurred. Now imagine a bitten
You know, that means that everybody was already affected, but the effects doesn't even like that. That's the thing about Dawn of the Dead. Everybody is already affected by the virus. everybody's already affected. You just gotta die in order to come back for it to take over. It needs a dead host. It can't live in a you know in a living host unless you got bit. But when you get bit, you start to die and it starts to take over.
Survivor fleeing an early encounter. Panicked, they crash on
Boom.
the way to a hospital or clinic. By the time the unconscious patient is admitted, the many injuries incurred from an automobile accident has masked any sign of infection. This individual then dies from their injuries, long after medical staff has assumed they were never infected in the first place. You see, in an urgent care situation like this, screening for a novel virus that just erupted onto the global stage like 24 hours ago is just not something that would happen.
And once those patients started reanimating inside the hospital, the response protocols collapsed almost immediately. They weren't built to handle people who died and came back to life, attacking the living inside the same building trying to treat them. Every step of their response made sense for an emergency the hospital thought it was handling, but none of it accounted for what those patients were actually about to do once they stopped breathing. Hospitals weren't the only place in the outbreak that turned on the people inside of it. The suburbs were a problem too. Early on, the lower density in those areas gave people a little more breathing room, but once the infected started pouring into the streets and everyone tried to leave at the same time, that margin disappeared fast. None of the places they were trying to reach were going to be any better, which brings me to what leaving actually meant in this movie, because nobody's escaping the Dawn of the Dead 2004 apocalypse if we're being honest here. The outbreak spread too far and too fast for that, and by the time the broadcast mentioned
And them niggas been booking. Them motherfuckers be booking. Them motherfuckers be running for real. And if you not up to shape, bro, you fucked. No cap.
Shanghai and Hong Kong had been destroyed by thermonuclear strikes, the idea of escaping to somewhere untouched was already gone. So leaving here means getting out of one failing position before it closes in around you, then doing it again and again. Anna's first position falls apart early in the movie. Her window to leave was closing while she was still asleep, and the reason it was closing is the same reason most people's first window closed in any collapse.
Leaving your fucking door unlocked. I be having to get on my mom. I like, bro, like, I know your plants need, like, put the plants outside and lock the door, bro. You never know what some shit like this gonna happen, bro. And all right, that screen door can barely fucking close.
The institutions that should have been telling her to move were actively telling her not to. The outbreak had been underway for hours by the time she got home from her shift. The press secretary was promising the whole thing would resolve inside 24 hours. The public was being told to stay calm and stay home. That's the worst possible combination during the early hours of a fast outbreak. The evidence was already visible, but the framing people were getting from the authorities they trusted was still describing a smaller problem. So most people did what the messaging told them to do, which was to stay put. And the exact hours where early movement still mattered were the hours the official message was keeping most people off the roads. In Dawn of the Dead, that delay is exactly what burns the first escape window away.
See, and look, like, this is why I think if it was to happen, I don't think they're gonna tell everybody, because even during like a hurricane, like, people were already like not even like 2 to 3 days of, everybody was already trying to get out, and all traffic was backed up for hours. Everybody trying to get out before the hurricane hit. For real.
Alright, now let's figure out what our escape windows actually look like in Dawn of the Dead 2004. If you've been keeping up with the series, you already know the first window. And if you're new, we call it the invisible window. It's the one most people will miss. By this point, the outbreak was already spreading, but most people were not moving yet. The roads still looked like ordinary life instead of the start of an outbreak. Gas stations, grocery stores, and highways all worked the way they did the day before. Leaving during this window meant moving before the city had visibly come undone. But leaving during this window was also a tall ask for a normal person, because a few strange reports usually aren't enough to warrant packing up your life and leaving. A few violent incidents in a different part of the city would get shrugged off as someone else's problem. And in a slower moving zombie outbreak, that instinct could have still left you a lot of room to recover from the delay. But this outbreak gave you neither of those things. The reanimation window was measured in minutes, and the thing that came back could run you down before you finished processing that they were on their feet heading straight for you. That changes the survival math immediately. A stalled lane on the highway that might have been manageable against classic walkers becomes a death sentence when the thing running at your car could cover distance in seconds. Somebody collapsing in the wrong place could turn into a fresh attack before the people around them have even processed that the person on the ground had had just stopped breathing. So if you left during the invisible window, you were not guaranteed safety. But what you got instead was enough time ahead of the first wave of panic to put some distance between yourself and the chaos, and enough control over where you went next, instead of sitting in a neighborhood where people reached the same conclusion in short staggered bursts, and then flooded the same roads at once. In a collapse like this, that narrow lead is the difference between rolling on an empty highway and dying somewhere crowded. The problem was that almost nobody was going to move that early. The signs just weren't clear enough for most people. By window 2, staying was more dangerous than moving, which is how most people finally made the call. By this point, the collapse was no longer hiding behind confusion. Anna woke up to people dying in her street and getting back up in front of everyone. The warnings weren't scattered anymore, they were happening right in front of her. Staying was inviolable because suburban houses weren't built for this. The ground floor windows, the sliding doors, and the hollow corridors simply were not built for a siege, and no one had enough time to harden any of it before the neighborhood turned. The advantage window 1 gave you, which was getting out before panic spread, was already gone. Window 2 wasn't a race against the outbreak. It was a race against everyone else making the same call at the same time. Residential streets that had been quiet 12 hours earlier were now funneling families and emergency vehicles towards the same main road. Roads that had been open hours earlier were already filling with people who reached the same conclusion just later than you did. Window 2 still got you out, it just didn't leave much room after that. So you could still get out, but you were leaving inside the surge instead of ahead of it. Reaching the mall meant the survivors escaped the first collapse phase. It did not mean they were suddenly in a position they could afford to trust. Now let's talk about why the mall was a smart move when the survivors first found it. The survivors were coming off of panicked neighborhoods and off jammed roads with open exposure to the dead, and the mall gave them advantages smaller shelters simply couldn't. A mall is a commercial structure built around enclosed space, controlled access, and stores already filled with supplies. During the first days of the collapse, that gives a group coming off the road exactly what they need, which is cover and the supplies to ride things out for a while. Not only that, but the exterior walls are thick. The upper levels gave them sightlines over the parking lot, and the interior was large enough that the group didn't have to pile into a cramped room with no second exit. CJ understood that part immediately, even if he took it into the wrong direction. His instinct was to lock the place down and hold the group tight. In the short term, that made sense. The mall did reward containment at first. The problem was that holding a place and living through the next phase were not the same thing. It also gave them something just as important after the initial chaos, which was a place to stop moving for a while. They could catch their breath, set watches, divide up the work, and start thinking straight again for the first time since everything fell apart. But the question is, what are they gonna do with the time it bought them? The trap started here. The mall held together long enough that the survivors stopped feeling immediate pressure to leave. They were no longer running from one bad decision to the next. Meals started happening on something close to an actual schedule. Sleep got deeper once people stopped expecting to be attacked in the night, and the building stopped feeling like temporary cover. That's when conversations about leaving started to fade. The outbreak beyond the parking lot was still spreading, and the outside world was already slipping into the kind of late response that shows up once authorities have lost control of the timeline. Even fortified shelters weren't holding. Fort Pastor was supposed to be the safe destination, and the signs it wasn't going to hold were already on the news.
A U.S. Army general can be seen discussing the military's response in Wisconsin. According to this military official, U.S. armed forces were conducting search and rescue missions in the area, literally telling people to either stay put or head towards what was, for a short time, an armed and fortified sanctuary. During the live broadcast, we even see infected individuals being admitted into the aforementioned safe zone, clearly showcasing that military officials did not yet fully grasp how the zombie contagion functioned. This is why there wasn't any codified screening procedures. Not long after that broadcast, we see a military helicopter fleeing the Milwaukee airspace, further foreshadowing the fate of Fort Pastor. Hell, it's likely that the chopper left the quarantine zone once an outbreak from within caused the fall of that safe zone. This, of course, was likely the clearest indicator of just how much shit had hit the fan.
That changed how the mall felt to the people inside it. If Fort Pastor was gone, then the building they were sitting in was no longer a temporary shelter on the way to something better. It was one of the few places still standing. And once the mall started feeling like that, staying became
That shit too fucking big to be in, bro. You can't cover all of that, bro.
easier than planning an escape. The third window opened in the weeks after the mall had become the most stable position the survivors had been in since everything fell apart. By that point, the building had done its job. The survivors had time to recover their nerves from the horror that chased them into the building. They had a roof over them, a defensible interior, and enough supplies to keep a routine going. But that was the point where staying was genuinely working, and trouble started when nobody used that time to plan what came after. The danger outside was easy to respect because it was visible the whole time. The danger inside settled in more slowly. way. It worked on habits first, then on how the group thought about the mall, and by the time it was affecting their decisions, the place already felt safer than anything they could see from the roof. So staying started to feel reasonable. They had walls around them and food and water within reach. They pushed hard to get there, and the building had finally started rewarding that effort, which was exactly why they stayed past the point where they should have been preparing to leave. But Andy's situation was the clearest example of where that kind of thinking ended. He was set up on a fortified rooftop across the lot, with clear sightlines and enough guns to keep the perimeter from closing in on him. About as strong a defensive position as anyone in the movie managed to build. But once his food started disappearing and the crowd below kept growing, that rooftop turned into the place where he slowly starved, while watching the dead fill in every route he could have used to leave. He learned the building fast and made smart decisions with what he had, and it didn't save him once the food ran out, and there was no way to resupply without going through the dead. The group also wasn't doing the basic things that could have kept them safe. The infection timeline was something they'd seen firsthand with Frank, and they still didn't enforce any kind of welfare check on the people they were already living with. That gap is what let Luda scratch
that shit is so fucking stupid, bro. It's like, bro, like, what? If you see her
stay
doing some
hidden long
weird
enough
shit,
to kill Andre, Norma, and the rest of the people caught in the toy store shootout.
I honestly think it was quite the oversight to not have anyone checking up on Andre and Luda. Like every time Andre was with the group, Luda was missing, and his attitude towards anyone asking him questions about her well-being was so overtly.
yeah, it's like the most dangerous motherfuckers in the zombie apocalypse are not zombies. It's other people. Other people become selfish, and they'll do anything to survive. It's hard. It's gonna be hard to find genuine people during the zombie apocalypse or any apocalypse.
Suspicious. It's kind of strange that nobody thought to do a welfare check on the woman expecting a baby, especially since many of them would have known about the close call Anna, Michael, and Luda had when they broke into the mall.
And to make matters worse, the survivors at the mall had Andy across the parking lot the whole time. A guy with a gun store, a rooftop, and a clear view across the lot. Instead, the relationship with him stayed purely social. The whole interaction with him basically turned into jokes, whiteboard messages, and picky off celebrity lookalikes instead of anything that made leaving easier. They could have used him to help map out a route across the lot, plan an extraction, or figure out how to bring him into the group before his position started falling apart. That's what getting too comfortable looks like in this movie. The group had time and didn't use it for anything that would have made leaving easier. When they finally did decide to leave, it wasn't because the mall had stopped working. It was because Kenneth gave a speech about not wanting to die in the building, and at that point, the group was ready to hear it. That's the problem with never planning your exit while you have time. You don't leave when the situation calls for it. You leave when somebody finally breaks down and says what everyone's been thinking all along. And by the time they acted on that speech, leaving no longer looked like a straightforward departure. Instead, it looked like armored shuttle buses, improvised plating, and a chainsaw pushed through narrow gaps, because the parking lot had already turned into a wall of bodies. Every piece of their exit was improvised under pressure, and the death toll on the way out made that plain as day. The mall had been holding for weeks. The escape burned through the group in a single sequence. If they had treated the building like a staging base earlier, the departure could have happened with more control, more margin, and fewer desperate variables stacked on top of each other. Now, if you walked away from Dawn of the Dead thinking the lesson was that malls make bad shelters, or that the zombies in the movie were unbeatable, you weren't looking at what the film was actually doing. This movie was about what happens when a group gets a working shelter and stops treating it as temporary, and uses none of the time it bought them to prepare for what came after. People in this movie missed the first window because bite victims were piling up in hospitals, while the news was still calling it race riots and civil unrest. They missed the second window because the mall was working so well that nobody turned the idea of leaving into an actual plan. Each time the reason for waiting was different, but each delay left them less prepared to act when they finally needed to. The mall was never the mistake. The mistake was spending weeks inside a functioning shelter without ever using that time to plan the exit they eventually had to make. When it came time to leave, it came as a rushed plan that didn't exist until the moment it cost them most of